What's up to Mnad Lectures? In this video, we're going to talk about the renal system. But if it is your very first time to watch me, please make sure you subscribe and you turn on the notification bell such that whenever I load a video, you are the very first person to watch it. So let's go ahead and get started with what we call the renal system. So looking behind here, this is what we call one of the parts of the renal system, or what we call the urinary system. So now, usually when we are talking about the renal system, we need to first understand what is the renal system or what is the urinary system all about. But generally, this is the system that is going to be responsible for filtering blood of the different metabolic waste and different toxins and different chemicals of our bodies. But before that, we need to first understand what are some of those parts that make up this urinary system. So now, this urinary system is made up of what we call the kidney. Is made up of what we call the kidneys, and the kidneys usually they are two. This system is also made up of what we call the ureter. It's also made up of what we call the ureters, and the ureters are also two. And then the third component is what we call the urine bladder. Is what we call the urine bladder, and the urine bladder is one. And then the last component is what we call the urethra. Is what we call the urethra. Okay, so now these are the four components that make up the urinary system, which we are going to be talking about. Giving a small highlight about these components, that it is the kidneys that are going to be responsible for the process of filtration. And these kidneys, they are bean shaped and they are located in the abdominal cavity behind the peritoneum. In other words, they are also under the retroperitoneal organs. Now, when we see the ureters are super important because the formed urine is going to be flowing off from the kidneys down into the bladder, that is from passing through what we call the ureters. In other words, the ureters, they are the tube-like structures through which urine from the kidneys flows down into our urine bladder. Then again, when we come to our urine bladder is a masticular sac organ that is responsible for keeping the urine temporarily before it is urinated off the body. And then lastly, when we talk about the urethra is the tube that connects the bladder, that connects the urine bladder to the outside environment. In other words, when the time for urinating reaches, this urine is going to be passing through the urethra to the outside of the environment. Okay? In other words, the urethra is aiming at providing that passage of urine from the bladder. Okay? So now, those are the simple components of what we call the urinary system. But do you think this urinary system is very important? Yes, it is very important. So let's have a look at some of those functions of the urinary system. Talking about the function of the urinary system, we know that the urinary system is made up of, now we have known, the kidneys, the ureter, the urine bladder, and the urethra. These systems, or these parts, they work together to make sure that the kidneys filter the blood and remove the waste products that come along with urine. It flows down through the ureters, gets stored temporarily into the bladder, and then finally off the environment through what we call the urethra. So now, we're going to be seeing that the first role of this urinary system is what we call excretory role. Excretory role. We are going to be seeing that this urinary system is going to be expelling off different metabolic wastes. What are some of these different metabolic wastes that are going to be eliminated by the kidneys? I want us to think of what we call the urea. One of the metabolic wastes that are going to be eliminated off by the kidneys. The second one is what we call the creatinine. The third one is what we call, of course, the drugs. The drugs which we eat are not stuck in our bodies. They are eliminated via what we call the kidneys. So drugs is one of the waste that are supposed to be eliminated off the system through the kidneys. And then the last one, also what we call the toxins. Okay, even the toxins can also be eliminated via what we call the urinary system. So now this is one of the excretory role of what we call the urinary system. And the secondary role is what we call regulatory, role. Is what we call regulatory role. And when we are talking about the regulatory role, we are going to be seeing that this urinary system is going to be helping in what we call reabsorption of different substances. Whenever the substances are becoming too much, it is also increasing in excretion, and whenever they are becoming low, it is aiming at increasing the levels. In other words, they are serving what we call a regulatory role. Now, when we are talking about the regulatory role, we shall be focusing about the following. Water balance is one of the regulatory role of the kidneys, okay? And the regulatory role is going to be water balance, okay, is what we call water balance. And then the second one is what we call, sometimes whenever the body is getting alkalosis or is getting metabolic acidosis, usually the kidneys play a very big role such that it keeps on eliminating some of these ions that are responsible for changing the levels of the pH. In other words, this urinary system is aiming at regulating what we call acid-base balance. Okay, acid-base balance. And another one is whenever we are having less of the electrolytes, the kidneys has that ability to retain depending on the amount of the electrolytes that are running in blood. If it is low, it regulates to make sure that it doesn't lose a lot. In other words, it is also aiming at regulating electrolyte balance. Okay, it is also doing what we call electrolyte balance. And when we're talking about electrolyte balance, the most important ones which I want you to focus on, we have what we call sodium, we have what we call potassium, we have what we call chloride, we have what we call the bicarbonate. There are very many electrolytes. But if I can ask, among these electrolytes, which one do you think is super very important? The most super very important among all these electrolytes that the body super depends on so much, in case of its variation, the body is in danger, is this one here. Okay, this one here. Potassium is super very important. If the levels of potassium varies extensively so much, problems will set in. For example, the levels of potassium is usually around 3.5 to 5.5 milliequivalent or millimole per liter, meaning that if the levels of potassium goes extensively too high, like around above 7 millimole per liter, that means this person is going to be having what we call hyperkalemia. And hyperkalemia is very dangerous, especially the severest, the cardiovascular system, the likelihood of someone getting what we call cardiac arrest. So now the levels of potassium are super very important. The third role is what we call the endocrine role. Okay, the third role is what we call the endocrine role. So we realize that the urinary system, we have some parts on the urinary system that are responsible for producing different types of hormones. For example, the kidneys are responsible for providing a specific type of hormone which we call erythropoietin. Okay, is providing us what we call erythropoietin. And also erythropoietin is super very important in regulation of what we call red blood cell production, which happens in the bone marrow. So whenever there's no red blood cells, it's going to be sensed by the kidneys, and then what we call the peritubular interstitial cells, which are responsible for the production of erythropoietin, they're going to be activated by what we call the hypoxia inducible factor, such that more of the erythropoietin is released to go and enhance the production of red blood cells. Super very important. And then another hormone which can be produced by the kidneys is what we call the renin. Okay, another one is what we call renin. Renin is super very important. You may ask yourself, where is renin produced? But when we go into the internal structure of the functional structure of the kidney, we shall see the nephron, and is where we're going to be having a specific area towards the entrance of the glomerulus around what we call the afferent arteriole. We are going to be having specialized types of cells, which we call the juxtaglomerular cells. These are the cells that are going to be releasing what we call renin, of which renin is one which is responsible for initiating the process of RAS. Okay. So now these are mainly the role of this renal system. And then maybe the last one is what we call the metabolic role. And of course, when you're talking about the metabolic role, is like activation of vitamin D, which enhance the absorption of calcium in the GIT. And of course, I may not go into the detail of that, but what you should know is that whenever there is sun rays hitting our skin, it's going to be changing, it's going to be stimulating the skin to release chemicals like cholesterol. Okay, you're going to be producing chemicals like cholesterol that travel into the liver and undergoes into enzymatic reactions, leading into what we call calcidiol. Okay, so this calcidiol is going to be now circulating in the kidneys, whereby the kidneys are going to be producing an enzyme. It's going to be producing an enzyme called alpha-1 hydroxylase, and that is almost around proximal convoluted tubule. So now this enzyme is going to be converting the calcidiol into what we call calcitriol, okay, which is going now the activated vitamin D that's going to go into the GIT and enhance the process of absorption of calcium. Okay, so now generally these are some of the few functions of what we call the renal, or what we call the urinary system. So having looked at the role of the urinary system, we want to go now into these components part per part. We are going to be starting with the one which is super very important, and that is none other than this big man you are seeing here. This one is what we call the kidney. This is where much of the work is going to be done, because the rest of the parts are going to be receiving everything that has been manufactured or filtered by what we call this big guy we are calling the kidney. So ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and understand critically and see what is happening exactly in this kidney. But again, we are going to first look into the anatomy, and then finally we shall go into the internal structures and see exactly what's going to be happening. Now, when we see this red blood vessel here, which is entering around this invagination, you see all this invagination on the anterior aspect of this kidney. They call this one the hilum. Okay, they call this one the what? They call this one the hilum. Okay, they call that one the hilum. So now the hilum is going to be providing entrance of different blood vessels and also exit of different structures, which we are calling the ureters. Okay, so now we're going to be having the entrance of the blood vessels, and of course there's some also exit of some of the blood vessels. And so now this blood vessel you are seeing, which is entering here, this blood vessel here which is entering, this is what we call the renal artery. Okay, this one is what we call the renal artery. So now this renal artery, when it enters inside here through the hilum, it's going to start splitting. Okay, so now when you see it very well start splitting, it splits into what we call segmental arteries. So now when you see these kind of small branches, these are what we call the segmental arteries. So now the segmental arteries are going to start now spreading into different areas. But before that, when you see this black area here, where you're having something like a pyramidal shaped like areas, that area is what we call the medulla. Okay, that area is what we call the renal medulla. And then the outside part where you are seeing this kind of area outside above this medulla, the whole of that area is what we call the renal cortex. Okay, in other words, the whole of this area where you are seeing these blood vessels with tiny balls, the whole of this area is what we call the renal cortex. But again, we also have a very thin, strong, fibrous tissue which is aligning the whole of this kidney. And that outside tough layer is what we call the renal capsule. Okay, is what we call the renal capsule. This outside thick, fibrous tissue is what we call the renal capsule. So now, when you see these black structures here, which are located in the medulla, these pyramidal-shaped kind structures, they call those ones the renal pyramid. Okay, in other words, the renal pyramid, these are the pyramidal-shaped like structures within the medulla. Okay, so now we are going to be focusing in those ones, and we're also going to be seeing how is blood passing through these different structures. Now, looking at this segmental artery, now when you have this segmental artery, it's going to start splitting and starts moving in between these renal pyramids. Okay, now the moment reaches this in between these renal pyramid, it gets a name. Okay, it gets a name. When it reaches there, the first one was the renal artery, the second one was segmental. Second one was segmental artery. The third one, in between this artery, which is in between the renal pyramid, is what we call interlobar artery. Okay, so now all these arteries you're going to be seeing in between the renal pyramids, they call those ones what we call the interlobar arteries. So now when these interlobar arteries reaches at the base, of these renal pyramids, they start splitting. Okay, they split and moves on the base of the renal pyramid. You see this one's moving at this point, and this one also moving at this point. Also this one comes and moves this point here. Also this one comes and moves this point here. Now, this kind of movement of these arteries here on the base of this renal pyramid, we have to give it a name. That artery, the fact that it is like in form of an arch, we give it a name. They call this one the arcuate artery. Okay, they call it the arcuate artery. Okay, so now they call it the arcuate artery. Then from the arcuate artery, we are going to be seeing some of these branches. Some of these branches coming off what we call the arcuate artery. These kind of projection, they are radiating towards the cortex. Okay, so now if they are radiating towards the cortex, let us give them a name. They are also called cortical radiate artery. Okay, cortical radiate artery. But there is another beautiful name, and that name is what we call interlobular artery. Okay, so it's what we call interlobular artery. Okay, interlobular artery. These ones, they are very many. They are extending of what we call the arcuate artery. Now, when you see very well on the interlobular artery, what we call the cortical radiate artery, we are going also to be having very tiny blood vessels coming from them. Very many tiny. These ones you are seeing coming off from them. But of course, if you see it very well, you are seeing there is a tiny blood vessel which is coming off this radiate artery, but there is again another bulbar structure. This bulbar structure. You're going to be seeing on bulbar structure on all of them. Now, from the interlobular artery, what we call the cortical radiate artery, that kind of artery which is just coming off before reaching this bulbar structure, that one is what we call the afferent arteriole. Okay, is what we call the afferent arteriole. Now, the afferent arteriole leads into these bulbar structures. You are seeing these bulbar structures. These bulbar structures, they are called the renal corpuscle. Okay, they are called the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle, they are made of what we call the glomerulus and of course the Bowman's capsule, meaning that it is this afferent arteriole that is leading into the glomerulus. Okay, so now that means in mind you have to put in mind that we are now circulating blood into what we call glomerulus. So now when you come and see this from the bulbar structure, we have another artery that is exiting. Okay, we have another artery, blood vessel, which is exiting. They call that one the efferent artery. Okay, they call that one as the efferent. Call it that one the efferent artery. Okay, so now the efferent artery. So now we want to see this blood from the efferent artery. Where else does it go? Where else does it go? So now when you see like these are the efferent artery, these are the efferent artery. So now they are going to be now starting to coil around this kind of coiled structure, which we shall see later, what we call the proximal convoluted tube. So now you're going to be finding that this efferent artery coming to coil around here, we're going to be having very many kind of these formation of what we call the capillaries. Okay, so now these capillaries, which is just this network of these capillaries here, this one here is what we call the peritubular capillaries. Is what we call the peritubular capillaries. Okay, the peritubular capillaries. And the tissues located within the peritubular capillaries, what we call the peritubular interstitial cells. Within these peritubular capillaries, this is the origin of the hormone, what we are calling erythropoietin. So now you see that these capillaries are going to be leading into what we call another bigger vein. You see this big vein here? This big vein here, they call it the interlobular vein. So now from the efferent arteriole, we are going to be going into what we call the peritubular capillaries, and then from there finally interlobular vein. Okay, interlobular vein. So now you see interlobular vein is now also going to be coming, or you may even call it corticoradiate vein. It's going to be coming. It's going to be coming, and then it unites with what we call the base of what we call the renal pyramid. So now when it joins this point here, it also starts moving. In line with what we call the aquatic artery. So now if the other one is the aquatic artery, that means this one becomes an aquatic vein. So now from the interlobular vein, we are also going to come into what we call the aquatic vein. So now the aquatic vein is now going to start coming here. This one, what we call the renal comb, that kind of the invagination of what we call the renal cortex. It's what we call the renal comb. So now we're going to be having now this kind of our vein. Whenever it becomes in between, passing through what we call the renal comb, it's called now interlobar vein. Okay, so now that one becomes interlobar vein. So now that one is our interlobar vein. Okay, so now interlobar vein just drains directly in this great vessel, and this great vessel is what we call the renal vein. We do not have what we call segmental veins, but of course with arteries we have what we call the segmental arteries, but for the case of the veins we do not have what we call segmental veins. Now that's just a brief flow of how this blood is going to be moving through different areas. But let's come back and see this point here, which we said the bulbar structures. We said that these bulbar structure, we said they are called the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle made up of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. So now, if you follow this structure here, you realize that it is having this kind of coiled structure. Moves inside into the medulla, comes back outside to the cortex, again moves back deep into the medulla. The whole of this kind of the arrangement is what we call the nephron. And of course, the nephron is the basic structural functional unit of this urinary system. So now this kind of movement is what we call the nephron. But now when you see these cortical radiate arteries, we have some kind of the nephrons that are going to be very far away from what we call the corticomedullary junction. That they are going to be some of these nephrons that are going to be far away from what we call the corticomedullary junction. So now these kind of nephrons that are very, very far away from the base of the medulla, they are called cortical nephrons. Okay, they are called cortical nephron, and they are the majority. Actually, they are around 85%. 85% of the nephrons are cortical nephrons. So now you realize that the bigger percentage of the nephrons, they are what we call the cortical nephrons. And again, when you see the cortical nephrons, when you see the way they are moving, they are not going to be again going deep into the renal medulla. They go slightly deep. First of all, on this loop, it doesn't move again deep as compared to this what we call the juxtamedullary nephrons. The juxtamedullary nephrons, their proximal convoluted tube just coils within the corticomedullary junction and then enters into the medulla, and then jumps out and then comes back. So now, whenever now this filtrate which is moving in this tube, remember the filtrate is going to be moving in this field following the hydrostatic processes which are going to be aiding in the filtration of different substances here. These substances are going to start moving along this coiled tube. This coiled tube from this Bowman's capsule, that kind of the coiled tube, they call that one as the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, they call that one as what we call the proximal convoluted tubule. And then from the proximal convoluted tubule, we are going to be seeing now another tube which is going to be now entering the medulla. This kind of tube that enters into the medulla here, they call it the loop of Henry. But of course, you're going to be having the thick, which is now the descending. We're going to be having the thin and also the ascending loop of Henry. Okay, so now the ascending loop of Henry is going to be moving off and then it goes off the medulla back into the cortex. And now in the cortex, we're going to be having these kind of coiled tube-like structures here. This one, they call it the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, these ones here, they are called the distal convoluted tubule. And again, the distal convoluted tube is going to be joining another tube that enters deep inside the medulla. This kind of tube that joins with what we call the distal convoluted tubule, they call that one as the collecting duct. Okay, they call that one as the collecting duct. So now the collecting duct is going to be moving deep into what we call the renal medulla. So now when it reaches into the renal medulla, we are going to be having a very, very small muscle-like structure here, which is like what we call the renal sphincter, that's going to be allowing the urine to ooze out into what we call this kind of fast structure here, this kind of small invagination here, where the urine is going to be dropping fast. They call that one as the renal papilla. Okay, they call that one as the renal papilla. So now when urine reaches the renal papilla, it's going to start now moving through what we call this kind of small tube you are seeing around here. This one here, this kind of tube, they call that one as the minor calyx. Okay, they call that one as the minor calyx. Now we are going to be having these minor calyx coming from different apex of this renal medulla. When they come together, when we form more than one minor calyx, again you're going to be making now a bigger pipe, and that bigger pipe is what we call the major calyx. So now when you see now this one is the minor calyx, but when they unite somewhere here, it becomes now big, meaning that it is major. Okay, major calyx having a combination of the minor calyx. So now it is this major calyx, different major calyx from different lobes or from different renal medulla are all going to be entering in this central-like structure around this point here. Okay, around this point here. They call this area as the renal pelvis. Okay, they call this area as the renal pelvis. And of course, the renal pelvis moves towards the hilum. The moment we exit the hilum, it is no longer the renal pelvis, but it gets another name. And that name is what we call the ureter. Okay, is what we call the ureter. And of course, the ureter is going to be dropping down the urine, and it gets stored in what we call the muscular sac-like structure, which you guys know what we call the urine bladder. Okay, what we call the urine bladder. So now, this is just a simple anatomical structural location of these different structures located within the kidney internally. So now, I'm going to cut a single lobe. I zoom it here, we see exactly what is happening inside. And when I talk of a lobe, the kidney has approximately more than around 8 to 10 lobes. That's what's located in the kidney. But here I've just drawn few of them, few of these lobes. But a lobe is this renal medulla with the surrounding cortex. Okay, with the surrounding cortex. So now this area up to the cortex, it becomes one lobe. Again, when we come to this point with the surrounding cortex at the base of the renal pyramid is what we call the lobe. So now I'm going to extract the whole of this lobe. I cut it out, I zoom it, we see exactly what is happening inside. Okay? All right. Looking at this structure here you are seeing here, it has been cut directly from one of the lobes located in the kidneys. So now, in other words, this one here is what we call a lobe. Okay, is what we call a lobe. And of course, as I told you, a lobe is going to be having this renal pyramid and also the renal cortex, which is in line with it, meaning that a lobe is a combination of the renal pyramid and the preceding renal cortex. So now we have seen that these veins which are inside here within the lobe to the other, now here there's going to be another lobe. So now these blood vessels, the vein is what we call the interlobar vein, and then the artery is what we call the interlobar artery. And I remember we said that these kind of blood vessels, the arteries, which are moving at the base of this renal pyramid, the artery is what we call the arcuate artery. Is what we call the arcuate artery. And of course, the vein which is moving along with it, this one is what we call the arcuate vein. So now we said that we have these kind of extensions. They are radiating off what we call the corticomedullary junction. They call these kind of blood vessels which are radiating off the corticomedullary junction. This one is what we call the interlobular. Is what we call the interlobular artery. Okay, interlobular artery. So now we said the interlobular artery is going to be having this kind of small extension, very many. So now this kind of extension, which is just next to what we call interlobular artery, they call that one as the afferent arteriole. Okay, they call that one as the afferent arteriole. So now the afferent arteriole is going to be now like here, this is the afferent arteriole, this is the efferent arteriole. But again, the afferent arteriole is leading into this bulbar structure here, which we called the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle is made up of the Bowman's capsule and the inside glomerulus, which is located inside. Now, we are going to be seeing what is exactly happening. So now when we see this bulbar structure, we're going to be seeing now this kind of coiled structures here. This kind of coiled structure, I call that one as the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, the proximal convoluted tubule, as it comes near to the corticomedullary junction, you're going to be having this kind of tube-like structures which are descending, and then it loops, and again it comes back. They call this one as the loop of Henle. Okay, the loop of Henry. And of course, it comes back, and then we're going to be having these coils, which is just near around what we call the corticomedullary junction, and they call that one as what we call the distal convoluted tubule. Now, this what we call this the efferent arteriole. Actually, this efferent arteriole is supposed to come and coil, around this proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, it's supposed to be coiling around these tubes here. Okay, so now, but this kind of coil which you are going to be seeing here, these ones here, they call that one, if you remember, they are called the peritubular capillaries. Okay, the peritubular capillaries. When we are talking about the urine formation, we shall see what is exactly happening at the what we call the peritubular capillaries. So now, because this kind of radiate artery, we are having this kind of a nephron, which is now towards the end of the cortex. I said this one is what we call the cortical nephron. And we said they are the leading, they are the majority of them. Now, we're going to be having this kind of nephron, which is going to be towards what we call the corticomedullary junction. The corticomedullary junction is this one here. So now, if you have the nephron, which is going to be starting from just within here, you're going to be having a very, very, very short proximal convoluted tubule. So now, the proximal convoluted tubule now gives off what we call the loop of Henry. So now, if you can measure very well the distance of the loop of Henry, which is moving deep into the renal medulla, for this kind of the nephron and this kind of the nephron, you realize that these nephrons, which we are calling the cortical nephrons, the loop of Henry is not so much deep as compared to this one, which we are calling the juxtag nephrons. Okay? So now, if you follow very well this efferent arteriole, for the case of these juxtaglomerular nephrons, which are just at the base of the renal pyramid, for them, where they move down into the renal medulla, and they give off these kind of different capillaries. So now, these kind of different capillaries, they make this kind of a mesh, which is going to be wound on this tube-like structure, which we are calling the loop of Henry. So now, this kind of network of this point here, these ones is what we call the vasa recta. Okay, is what we call the vasa recta. The vasa recta is super very important. We shall see it in detail when we are talking about urine formation and concentration. Okay, so now this one here is what we call the vasa recta. So now, when this loop of Henry now moves, or when the urine is getting concentrated, now this point here is what we call now the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, the distal convoluted tubule. Now, the distal convoluted tubule comes in contact with this very long tube. This very long tube, which is going to be uniting very many nephrons from different areas. And they call this one as the collecting duct. They call this one's called the collecting duct. So now this collecting duct is going to be having urine, is going to be having urine. But again, we shall see what is going to be happening in the collecting duct when we are talking about the physiology of what we call the nephron. Okay, so now as it is moving down, collecting all the urine, and eventually our urine is going to be coming out. So now this one here is our urine. But before reaching this point here is what we call the renal papilla. Okay, the renal papilla. Now, from the renal papilla, if you remember very well, it is going to go into what we call the minor calyx. From the minor calyx, we're going to be having a union of different minor calyxes, making what we call the major calyx. And of course, the major calyx are going to pour into what we call the renal pelvis. And of course, the renal pelvis will now drain the urine through what we call the ureter, which exits at what we call the hilum. that has just been a brief introduction about the urinary system, explaining the anatomy or the blood flow on this kidney. It has been something very, very, very crucial in the introduction of what we call the urinary system. So now in proceeding videos, we are going to be now extracting. We are going to extract this kind of tube-like structure, what we are calling the nephron, and we enter into it in detail and see exactly how is it able to make, how is it going to be making the urine. And if you find that this video has been helpful to you, it has added something to you, please make sure you like this video. And if you think there is a friend of yours who is going to be benefiting from this video, please share this video to that person. Okay, it has been Tumunad as always. Until we meet next time.